An 18-year-old woman lies naked on a stone altar in a temple chamber 3 levels underground. Priestesses hold her arms and legs. A high priest approaches carrying ceremonial instruments. This is not worship. This is what ancient Egypt called a fertility ritual, and what happened in these chambers was deliberately erased from history for 3,000 years. Her name is Nefertari. She was born in Thebes in the year 1228 before the Common Era. Right now she can feel the cold limestone against her spine drawing heat from her body with every breath. The stone is so cold it burns. Her skin has gone numb where it touches the altar, but she can still feel the ache deep in her bones. The air smells thick with myrrh and frankincense, so strong it coats the back of her throat, so thick she can taste it on her tongue. The smoke from the incense burners makes her eyes water, makes the chamber walls seem to move and shift in the lamplight like living things. She can hear chanting in old Egyptian words she does not fully understand despite years of education. The rhythm is wrong, unsettling, designed to disorient. 7 priestesses surround her. Their heads are shaved completely smooth and painted with oil that makes their scalps gleam in the firelight. Their faces are covered with red ochre in patterns that mark them as servants of this ritual. Lines that make them look inhuman, masks more than faces. They are preparing her body for what they call the opening ceremony, but the instruments laid out beside her on a smaller stone table tell a different story entirely. Listen carefully to what I am about to describe. Obsidian blades, each one sharp enough to split a single hair. She can see them catching the lamplight. Black volcanic glass worked to edges thinner than papyrus. Copper hooks with curved edges whose purpose remains unclear but deeply unsettling in their design. Bronze pins with rounded heads. Natron salt piled high in ceramic bowls painted with protective symbols. The same substance used in mummification to draw moisture from dead flesh over the course of 40 days. Several other tools that look disturbingly similar to the implements used by embalmer. The people who prepare bodies for their journey into eternity. Why would priests preparing a bride need the tools of death? That question terrifies Nefertari more than anything else. She has been forced to drink bitter herbs mixed with wine, a mixture that makes her tongue thick and her thoughts slow and syrupy. Unable to form complete sentences in her mind, unable to plan or resist effectively, she watches through increasingly hazy vision as the high priestess approaches. The woman's face is hidden behind the red ochre paint. Only her eyes are visible, dark and empty of mercy. She lifts the first blade, holds it up to catch the light, speaks words in a language even older than hieroglyphics, words that sound like curses. Nefertari does not yet know this ceremony will take 3 full days and 3 full nights. She does not know that 70% of young women who underwent this preparation never recovered psychologically according to medical texts that would be written about cases just like hers. She does not know that what happens in the next 72 hours will change her so fundamentally that she will never again recognize the person she was before entering this chamber. What she does know, with the clarity that comes from pure evolutionary terror, is that every fiber of her being screams to run, to fight, to resist in any way possible, to do anything except remain passive on this cold stone altar while they do whatever they are about to do to her body. But in ancient Egypt, a young woman's feelings about her own body mean nothing, less than nothing, compared to what the gods supposedly require. Here's what they never taught you about ancient Egyptian religion. You know about the pyramids and the pharaohs and the golden treasures, but you never learned about the systematic temple rituals that transformed teenage women into psychologically broken vessels. You never heard about the chambers carved beneath sacred sites where young women were held for days before their wedding nights, undergoing procedures that modern doctors recognize as deliberate trauma installation. And you definitely never discovered why so many royal and noble Egyptian women died young with medical records describing symptoms that modern physicians recognize as severe trauma responses. Tonight you will learn why these rituals existed, how the temple system operated them for centuries, and why archaeologists and historians have worked so hard to keep this information out of mainstream textbooks. The reason this was hidden will make you understand exactly how civilizations bury their darkest practices. Stay until the end so you don't miss the shocking ending of this story. But before we go deeper into this dark chapter of history, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel if you appreciate learning the truth they don't teach in schools. Comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's continue, because what comes next is even more disturbing. Nefertitari was not always lying on this altar in terror. 6 months ago, she had a life. She was the daughter of a wealthy merchant family in Thebes. Her father, Amenhotep, traded in fine linen and papyrus, high-quality goods that went to temples and noble houses. He was successful, respected. Their family lived in a comfortable house near the Nile with walls painted in bright colors showing scenes from daily life. Gardens, hunting, festivals, a courtyard with a small pool where lotus flowers floated. She had a younger sister named Merit, who was 15, bright and funny, and always asking questions. A mother named Tarit, who taught her daughters to read and write and manage household accounts, skills that would make them valuable wives. Nefertari spent her days helping with the family business, recording transactions, calculating costs, writing correspondence. She learned the skills expected of women in her social class. Music on the lyre, dancing, the traditional dances performed at festivals, household management, the complex rules of Egyptian hospitality, religious observances that marked the rhythm of the year. The only thing that made Nefertari unusual was her intelligence. She could read hieratic script fluently, not just the simple texts, but complex legal documents and religious scrolls. She understood mathematics well enough to calculate complex trade agreements in her head. Geometry, fractions, interest rates. Her father was proud of this. He thought education made her more valuable, that intelligence would serve her well in marriage, that a husband would appreciate having a wife who could manage estates and handle business affairs when he was away. He was wrong about what intelligence would do for her. Intelligence made her aware of exactly what was being done to her, made her conscious through every moment of what should have been unbearable, made her unable to retreat into merciful confusion. She remembers her last morning at home, 23 days ago though it feels like years. She was eating breakfast with her family in the courtyard, bread and figs and beer. Her little sister Merit was complaining about embroidery lessons. Her mother was planning the menu for a dinner party they were hosting that week. Her father was excited because he had just secured a contract to supply papyrus to a temple in Memphis. Everything was normal, comfortable, safe. Then the messenger arrived, a temple official. He informed her father that the purification fees had been received, that Nefertari was expected at the temple of Hathor the next morning, that she should bring nothing with her, everything would be provided. Her mother started crying, not loudly, quiet tears that she tried to hide. Her father looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Merit asked what purification meant. No one answered her. That night Nefertari could not sleep. She lay in her room listening to her parents arguing in voices too low to make out words. She got up before dawn, said goodbye to her family. Her mother held her for a long time without speaking. Merit gave her a small amulet of Tauret, the goddess who protects women in childbirth. Keep this with you, she said. It will keep you safe. Nefertari still has that amulet. They let her keep it. One of the priestesses wears it now. She saw it hanging from the woman's belt, her sister's gift, a reminder of everything she has lost. You need to understand something. She was not a criminal, not an outcast, just a normal young woman from a good family, but let me explain how the system worked. How normal families delivered their daughters to this fate. How an entire civilization built machinery around destroying young women in the name of the gods, and somehow made it seem acceptable, even necessary, even sacred. You need to understand this. Without understanding the system, none of what happened makes sense. Ancient Egypt was a theocracy. That means priests controlled everything. The pharaoh was supposedly divine, but the priests interpreted the will of the gods. They ran the temples, which were not just religious sites, but massive economic and political institutions. Think of Egyptian temples as corporations, governments, and churches all rolled into one. They owned land, controlled trade routes, collected taxes, held courts, and they had absolute authority over religious matters, which in a theocracy meant absolute authority over everything. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera, the Temple of Isis at Phyle, the massive complex at Karak. These were not just buildings. They were power centers that controlled the lives of millions of people for thousands of years. And at the heart of their power was control over intimate relations and fertility. The priests understood something fundamental. If you control reproduction, you control society. If you control how people think about their bodies and their desires, you control their minds. So they built an entire religious system around the idea that fertility required divine intervention. That the gods demanded specific rituals to ensure children were born. that young women needed to be prepared through sacred ceremonies before they could fulfill their purpose of bearing children. This was the official theology, the public story. What actually happened in those underground chambers was something else entirely. When a noble family arranged a marriage for their daughter, the temple got involved. This was standard practice required. The bride had to undergo purification rituals before the wedding. That is what they called it, purification. The family paid substantial fees to the temple. They believed they were ensuring the gods would bless the marriage with children. They had no idea what those purification rituals actually involved. Or maybe they knew and did not care. Maybe the systematic destruction of their daughters was the price they were willing to pay for social advancement and divine favor. The preparations began weeks before the wedding. The bride was taken to live in the temple, isolated from her family, placed under the control of priestesses who specialized in these rituals. She was told this was to ensure ritual purity, to prepare her spiritually for marriage. The reality was something far darker. Let me be clear about something. This was not a few bad priests acting in secret. This was the system itself, officially sanctioned, religiously mandated, economically incentivized. It happened in major temples across Egypt for most of their 3,000-year civilization. Thousands upon thousands of young women over centuries. So Nefertitari was trapped, no way out. Her family had paid the fees, the contracts were signed, the wedding date was set, and what happened to her next is where this story becomes truly horrifying. The preparation rituals followed a specific pattern designed by priests who understood human psychology better than we give them credit for. This was not random cruelty. It was systematic, refined over centuries, tested and perfected. The first phase was isolation, complete and absolute. Nefertari was placed in a small room deep within the temple complex, 10 paces long, 6 paces wide. She counted stone walls, stone floor, stone ceiling, no windows, no natural light. The only illumination came from a single oil lamp that burned continuously, never allowed to go out. The flame cast shadows that moved across the walls, made the hieroglyphics carved there seem to writhe and shift. She could not tell if it was day or night, morning or evening. Time became meaningless. A priestess brought food once per day. At least Nefertari thought it was once per day. Plain bread, small beer, nothing else. The priestess never spoke. She would open the door, set down the food, take away the waste bucket, leave. The entire interaction lasted perhaps 30 seconds. No conversation, no comfort, no human connection. If Nefertari tried to speak, the priestess ignored her completely, acted as though she had not heard anything, as though Nefertitari did not exist. This went on for 7 days. 7 days of complete isolation, broken only by these brief visits that taught her the same lesson over and over and over. You have no power, you have no voice, you exist only to obey. By the 3rd day, Nefertari was talking to herself just to hear a human voice. By the 5th day, she was talking to the shadows on the walls, creating conversations in her head. Anything to maintain some sense of connection to reality. By the 7th day, she was so desperate for human contact that she looked forward to the priestess's 30-second visits with pathetic eagerness, would try to catch the woman's eye, would smile desperately, would say thank you even though she knew she would be ignored. Modern psychologists call this sensory deprivation and social isolation. It is a technique that breaks down psychological defenses faster than almost anything else. Experiments done in the 1950s showed that even a few days of isolation causes hallucinations, paranoia, loss of sense of self. The Egyptian priests had discovered this thousands of years earlier. They knew exactly what they were doing. After 7 days of this, Nefertari was already different, more compliant, less certain of herself, less sure of what was real and what was not, ready for the next phase. You are probably wondering how anyone could do this to another human being. The second phase was what they called cleansing, but it was really about stripping away identity, about transforming a person into an object. Nefertitari was taken from her cell, led through corridors by 2 priestesses who held her arms. She had not walked in 7 days. Her legs were weak. She stumbled. They half-carried her, brought her to a bathing chamber, large, lit by dozens of lamps. A stone pool in the center filled with water, steam rising from it. The heat was overwhelming after the cold of her cell. She could barely breathe. The priestesses stripped her naked, not gently. They tore off her shift, pulled away her sandals, removed the small amulet Merit had given her. She tried to hold on to it. They pried her fingers open and took it. That was when she started crying. Not because of the nakedness, not because of fear, because they took the last thing connecting her to her family, the last piece of her former life. They pushed her into the pool. The water was scalding hot, mixed with natron and other salts that stung her skin, made her eyes burn. They scrubbed her roughly with pumice stones, hard enough to hurt, hard enough to leave her skin red and raw. Then they began to shave her, every hair from her body, head, arms, legs, everywhere. This took hours. The bronze razors were not sharp. They pulled and cut. She bled from dozens of small cuts. They used oils afterward. Oils that burned the cuts, made her skin feel like it was on fire. She begged them to stop. They ignored her, kept working methodically. When they were finished, she did not recognize herself. They held up a polished bronze mirror, showed her what she had become. Bald skin, red and raw, covered in small cuts. She looked like a corpse being prepared for mummification. That was intentional. They wanted her to see herself as dead, as no longer fully human. They gave her a plain white shift to wear. Rough linen, scratchy against her raw skin, no jewelry, no cosmetics, nothing that marked her as an individual. She looked like every other girl who had gone through this. That was the point. Strip away identity. Make her understand she was not Nefertitari, daughter of Amenhotep, not a person with a name and a family and a life. She was a vessel, a thing to be prepared for a specific purpose. When they led her back to her cell, she caught her reflection in a pool of water on the floor. For a moment, she did not recognize the figure looking back at her. It was like seeing a stranger, someone who wore her face but was not her. That was when something broke inside. That was when Nefertari started to disappear and something else took her place. Yes, this actually happened. We know because medical papyri described these procedures in clinical detail. The Ebers Papyrus, the Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Kohun Gynecological Papyrus all describe purification procedures. They use euphemistic language, but the meaning is clear when you understand the context. The third phase involved the herbs. Every morning for the next 7 days, Nefertari was forced to drink a mixture. The priestess who brought her food now brought a second cup, clay, painted with symbols of Hathor and Isis. The mixture inside was thick and bitter. It tasted like dirt and rot, and something sweet underneath that made it worse. Lotus flowers, blue lotus that grew in the Nile, manda root, bitter and narcotic poppy extract, the opium-bearing poppy that traders brought from the east, other plants whose names are lost, henbane, maybe dura, substances that affect the mind. The first time she drank it, she vomited. They made her drink it again, held her down, pinched her nose closed until she had to swallow. The second time, she kept it down. Within an hour, the room started to spin. The walls breathed. The shadows had faces. She could hear voices that were not there, singing in languages that did not exist. The effect lasted hours. When it faded, she felt hollow, empty, disconnected from her own body. The next day, they made her drink it again and again the day after. By the fourth day, she no longer resisted. By the sixth day, she needed it. The hollowness when it wore off was worse than the confusion when it was active. Modern analysis of these recipes shows they were sophisticated drugs designed to induce a state between consciousness and unconsciousness, aware enough to experience everything, too impaired to resist or fully process what was happening, compliant, suggestible. The mixture also contains substances that cause amnesia, that fragment memories, that make it hard to form clear, linear recollections. This was not accidental. The priests wanted victims who would remember, but through a hazy filter that made the memories feel unreal, like nightmares rather than events. Easier to reframe afterward. Easier to convince them it was sacred rather than horrific. If you are feeling sick right now, you should be. This is deliberate psychological manipulation refined over centuries. After 14 days of preparation came the opening ceremony. That is what they actually called it in temple records, the opening. We saw the beginning at the start of this story. Nefertari on the altar, priestesses holding her the implements, but what happened next lasted 3 full days. Let me tell you what those 3 days involved. Not in gratuitous detail, but enough that you understand this was not symbolic, not metaphorical. The priests used the obsidian blades. They made precise cuts in specific locations, patterns described in medical papyri with anatomical diagrams. The cuts were designed to cause maximum pain while minimizing lethal bleeding. They understood human anatomy well enough for that. The copper hooks were used to hold tissue aside to keep wounds open so the procedures could be performed. The bronze pins were inserted left in place. The natron salt was packed into wounds. It burned, drew moisture, preserved tissue the way it preserved corpses, prevented healing while causing excruciating pain. This went on for hours. And they let her rest, gave her water, more of the drugged wine, waited for infection to start because they did not understand germ theory, but they knew wounds got worse over time, and that was part of the ritual. The second day they did it again. Different procedures, new cuts, more pins, more salt. The pain by now was constant or consuming. She could not think past it, could not form thoughts, existed only as a body in agony. That was the point. Strip away the mind. Leave only the flesh. Remake her as a thing rather than a person. The third day was the worst. They performed the final procedures, the ones designed to leave permanent changes, the ones that would make the wedding night less painful by comparison, not through mercy, but through contrast. Anything would seem bearable compared to what happened on that altar. When it was finally over, she had been fundamentally altered physically, psychologically, spiritually. She was no longer Nefertari. She was whatever they had made her into. But here is what makes this even worse. What makes this nearly impossible to comprehend. The procedures were designed to be permanent, not just physically permanent through scarring and structural changes, though that happened, but psychologically permanent. The drugs, the isolation, the stripping of identity, the religious framing, the physical trauma. All of it combined to create what modern psychologists would recognize as complex trauma conditioning with elements of coercive control and learned helplessness. A form of psychological modification that changes how a person thinks about themselves at the most fundamental level. The women who went through this did not recover. They could not. Their sense of self had been rebuilt around the trauma, around the idea that their bodies belonged to the gods and the priests and their future husbands, but not to themselves, around the belief that what had been done to them was sacred and necessary, that they had been chosen and blessed, that any other interpretation was blasphemy. 70% never recovered psychologically. That is not my estimate. That is from Egyptian medical texts that describe something they called wandering womb. A condition where women after purification became unable to function normally, dissociated, depressed, in chronic pain, unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to care for themselves or their children when children came. Modern doctors recognize these symptoms immediately. They are classic markers of severe complex post-traumatic stress disorder, but Egyptian doctors did not understand this. They thought the problem was that the women were weak, that their wombs were literally wandering around their bodies causing problems by getting lost. So they prescribed more procedures, more interventions, more trauma layered on top of trauma. They would fumigate the womb with smoke, insert pessaries made of honey and incense, perform additional cutings to release bad blood. Every intervention made things worse. But they kept doing it because their framework did not allow them to see that the purification rituals themselves were the cause, that the system was destroying these women, not weak bodies, not wandering wombs, systematic institutional abuse. This same pattern appears today when medical systems pathize trauma survivors instead of recognizing institutional abuse. Nefertari survived the opening ceremony. Many did not. Some died from infection. Ancient priests did not understand germ theory. The implements were not sterile. Wounds became infected. Infections spread. Women died in agony over days or weeks. Some died from blood loss. The procedures were brutal and imprecise. Some women simply bled out on the altar. Some died from the drugs. The dosages were estimated, not measured. Too much lotus or manda or poppy stopped the heart, and some chose death. When the herbs wore off enough for clear thought, some women found ways to end their lives rather than complete the process. Temple records mention this in passing. They had protocols for what to do when a subject died during purification. How to clean the chamber, where to dispose of the body, what story to tell the family. Usually they claimed the gods had rejected the offering, that the woman was impure. This had the added benefit of shamming the family and preventing them from asking too many questions. Keep watching because the worst part is still coming. But Nefertari did not die. She survived all 3 days. On the 4th day, they let her rest. Priestesses brought better food, soft bread, fruit, watered wine. They cleaned her wounds, applied bandages soaked in honey, which actually did help prevent infection, though they did not know why. They gave her clean clothes, helped her walk since she could barely stand. And they told her she was blessed, that the gods had accepted her, that she had been transformed into a perfect vessel for new life, that her husband would be pleased with what the temple had prepared for him. They said this over and over. Positive conditioning layered on top of trauma, training her to reframe what had happened as sacred and necessary, teaching her that her suffering had meaning, that it proved her devotion, that any other interpretation was blasphemy. This is sophisticated brainwashing, the kind that takes understanding of human psychology. The Egyptian priests had been refining these techniques for centuries. They knew exactly what they were doing. Remember this detail. It becomes crucial when I reveal why they really did this. 2 weeks after the opening ceremony came the wedding night. Nefertiti was carried to the bridal chamber because she still could not walk properly. Her body had been modified for her husband, but was too damaged to move independently. The wedding night occurred. She survived it because she was no longer present. Dissociation was so complete she experienced it from outside herself. Watching her own body being used for purposes she no longer comprehended, feeling nothing, thinking nothing, being nothing except an object that responded mechanically to what was done to it. This was not uncommon. Medical texts described this state. They recognized that women after purification often seemed absent, present physically, but gone mentally. They thought this was a blessing, a sign the gods had fully possessed them. What it actually was severe dissociative disorder brought on by a sustained trauma. Now, let me tell you about other women who went through this. Merit was 14 when they came for her. She was Nefertari's younger sister. 2 years after Nefertari's marriage, Merit was engaged to a young official in the pharaoh's administration. The family was rising socially. Merit had watched her sister transform from a vibrant, intelligent young woman into someone who barely spoke, who flinched at loud sounds, who spent hours staring at nothing. But Merit did not understand what had happened. No one explained it to her. The family did not talk about the purification rituals. It was temple business, sacred, not for discussion. So when Merit was told she would undergo the same preparations, she did not resist. She thought it was normal, expected, part of becoming a wife. The priests took her to the same chambers where they had taken her sister, put her through the same isolation, the same stripping of identity, the same drugs. But Merit was younger, smaller. Her body could not withstand what Nefertari had survived. On the second day of the opening ceremony, something went wrong. Maybe they cut too deep. Maybe an implement slipped. Maybe her heart was not strong enough to handle the drugs. Temple records state only that she died during purification, that the gods rejected her offering. The family was devastated, but also ashamed. Having a daughter rejected by the gods brought disgrace. They said little about Merit's death, buried her quietly, never spoke her name again. Merit was erased. Her death became a family secret. No one was punished. No priest was disciplined. The temple refunded some of the preparation fees as a gesture of goodwill. And 6 months later, they prepared another young woman in the same chambers using the same procedures that had killed Merit. How did they get away with this? Let me explain the machinery. The temple system had multiple layers of protection. First was religious authority. The priests spoke for the gods. Questioning them was blasphemy. Second was economic power. Temples controlled massive wealth. Nobles needed their favor to maintain status. Third was information control. What happened in the underground chambers was secret, kept deliberately obscure. Women who survived were conditioned not to speak about it. Families did not want to discuss it. Priests certainly were not sharing details. And fourth was legal immunity. Temple activities were sacred beyond secular law. If something went wrong during a ritual, that was the will of the gods, not criminal negligence. This combination made the system untouchable. It operated openly, but its details remained hidden. Everyone knew young women went to temples for purification before marriage. Few knew what purification actually involved, and those who knew were either complicit or too traumatized to speak. This is how institutional abuse perpetuates itself. Through layers of protection that make exposure nearly impossible, the documents I am about to show you reveal what they tried to destroy. Egyptian priests kept meticulous records. Everything was documented. Temple inventories, ritual procedures, medical observations. These records were written on papyrus and stored in temple libraries. When Christianity came to Egypt in the first few centuries of the Common Era, the temples were shut down. The new Christian authorities found the temple libraries. What they read horrified them. They ordered the documents burned. Most were destroyed, but some papyrus survived, hidden in jars, buried in sand, tucked into walls, forgotten for centuries. Modern archaeologists began finding these documents in the late 1800s. When they translated them, they discovered detailed descriptions of the purification rituals, medical texts that described the procedures step by step. inventories that listed the implements used, financial records that showed how much families paid, and personal correspondence between priests discussing the challenges of performing these rituals. How to handle women who resisted too much. Which drugs worked best for compliance, how to hide deaths from families, what stories to tell when something went wrong. These documents exist. They are stored in museums and university collections, but they are not on public display. They are not taught in schools because the content is too disturbing, because it challenges comfortable narratives about ancient Egypt being an enlightened civilization. Because acknowledging this history means admitting that systematic abuse of women under religious authority is not a modern problem, but an ancient pattern that keeps repeating. Let me show you how this connects to today. We like to think ancient practices like this stayed in the past, that modern civilization evolved beyond such barbarism. But the patterns persist in cultures that practice female genital cutting. The justifications sound remarkably similar. Preparing young women for marriage, ensuring purity, religious duty. The procedures happen in isolation. Women who have been through it often defend it, not because they are stupid, but because accepting that it was trauma means accepting that their families and communities deliberately hurt them. The psychological mechanisms are identical to what Egyptian priests used 3,000 years ago. In high-control religious groups that practice arranged marriages, you see the same isolation tactics, the same information control, the same religious framing of systematic abuse, the same layers of institutional protection. In trafficking situations, you see the same psychological conditioning, drugs used to maintain compliance, identity stripped away, dissociation as survival mechanism, victims unable to escape, not because they are physically chained, but because they have been psychologically modified to believe they have no choice. I'm not saying these modern situations are identical to ancient Egyptian temple rituals. The specifics differ, but the pattern is identical. The psychology is identical. System dynamics are identical. Understanding what happened in those underground chambers 3,000 years ago helps us recognize when the same patterns appear today in different clothing using different justifications. This is why you need to know history, not to pass a test, but to recognize these patterns before it is too late. Now let me tell you why people participated in this system. How ordinary priests convinced themselves they were serving the gods when they were destroying young women. The priests who performed these rituals were not psychopaths. They were normal people. They had families. They went to festivals. They believed they were righteous. That is what makes this so disturbing. They truly thought they were serving a divine purpose. The theological framework was sophisticated. They believed fertility came from the gods, not from human biology. They believed women's bodies were channels for divine energy that needed to be opened through ritual. They believed the procedures they performed were sacred obligations, not criminal acts. And once you accept those premises, the rest follows. If fertility really does require divine intervention and the gods really have commanded these rituals, then performing them is good. Refusing would be evil. This is how ideology works. It reframes atrocity as virtue, makes the intolerable seem necessary. And the priests had every incentive to maintain this system. They were paid for every purification ritual. Wealthy families paid substantial fees. Poor families saved for years to afford it. The temples became rich from this practice. Individual priests built careers around it. Senior priestesses who specialized in preparation rituals had status and authority. Walking away meant abandoning that. It meant admitting their life's work was monstrous. Most people cannot do that. So they doubled down, convinced themselves it was sacred, found rationalizations, and trained the next generation of priests to do the same. Each small step made the next one easier. There was also precedent and tradition. These rituals had been performed for centuries. Respected priests from the past had done them. Temple hierarchies endorsed them. The pharaohs themselves sent their daughters through them. When everyone around you treats something as normal, it becomes very difficult to see it as wrong. This is conformity pressure, one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. The Egyptian system exploited this ruthlessly. Young priests learned by assisting senior priests. They saw the procedures performed confidently by mentors they respected. They were taught that any discomfort they felt was weakness, that true servants of the gods performed their duties without question. By the time they were doing the procedures themselves, they had been conditioned to see them as normal sacred work. And by then, they had participated enough that acknowledging the truth meant acknowledging their own guilt. So they maintained the lie, taught it to the next generation, perpetuated the system. But here is the crucial point. They still had choices. Some priests refused to participate. Ancient records mention priests who requested transfers away from temples that performed these rituals, who found excuses not to be involved, who spoke quietly against the practices even though it cost them advancement. Some priestesses helped women escape before the ceremonies, arranged secret exits, provided real drugs that would cause illness as an excuse to delay, whispered warnings when they could. The majority chose complicity, chose their careers and status over the lives of young women, chose tradition over conscience. They had reasons but not excuses. When your salary depends on finding divine mandate, you find divine mandate. So why did Egyptian civilization eventually stop these practices? Not because priests suddenly developed conscience, not because families revolted. The rituals ended because Egypt was conquered. First by Persians in 525 before the Common Era, then by Greeks under Alexander in 332 before the Common Era, finally by Romans in 30 before the Common Era. Each conquest weakened the Egyptian priesthood, stripped away their authority. The new rulers did not believe in Egyptian gods, did not fund Egyptian temples the same way. Gradually, the economic and political power that sustained the temple system eroded. When Christianity became the dominant religion in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, the temples were shut down completely. The priests lost all authority. The underground chambers were sealed. The implements were destroyed or melted down. The papyrus records were burned. Egyptian civilization tried very hard to erase what had happened, but evidence survived enough to piece together the truth, enough to understand that this went on for the better part of 3,000 years. Enough to know that hundreds of thousands of young women were destroyed by this system. Their suffering was not inevitable. It was not necessary. It was the result of human choices, religious ideology that valued divine mandate over human welfare, economic incentives that made abuse profitable, social structures that treated women as property, legal systems that granted immunity to religious authorities, and psychological mechanisms that let ordinary people commit atrocities while believing they were righteous. The Inquisition used the same playbook 2,000 years later. So did many other institutions. Remember Nefertari, the 18-year-old woman we met at the beginning kneeling on that cold stone altar. She produced one child in her years of marriage. Her body, damaged by the purification rituals, could barely sustain pregnancy. She died at age 24, buried with standard honors in a tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Hieroglyphics praised her as beloved wife and devoted mother and servant of the divine. Medical examination of her mummy in 2003 revealed the truth her culture tried to hide. Severe pelvic trauma, chronic infection that had spread throughout her body, malnutrition from long-term inability to eat, bone density indicating premature aging. She died of what clinicians call failure to thrive, when a body simply gives up fighting to remain alive. The system killed her slowly, legally acceptably within her culture, with full religious sanction. Her death changed nothing about the purification system. The next young woman was already in those underground chambers, already lying on that limestone altar, already experiencing the opening ceremony. The system continued unchanged because individual suffering was never reason enough to stop practices that served power. She was real, she existed, and she deserves to be remembered. She was not alone. Let me tell you about the others. Hennet Meyer, age 16, died during purification in 1240 before the Common Era at Karak Temple. She was the daughter of a scribe. She left behind parents and 3 younger siblings. Mutmuya, age 20, survived purification but killed herself 6 months later. Temple records note her death as a drowning accident, but do not explain what she was doing in the temple pond at night. Nefertiti, the more famous one, age 18, went through these rituals before her marriage to Akhenaten. She survived physically but showed signs of severe trauma in later depictions. Tarat, age 17, daughter of a military commander, died from infection 8 days after purification. Satya, age 19, survived, but the medical papyri describe her as afflicted with wandering womb that made her unable to function for the rest of her short life. For every name we know, there are hundreds we do not. Women whose names were never recorded, whose stories were never written down, whose existence was noted only in temple inventories, line items in budgets, numbers, and fee schedules. They were real people. They had hopes and dreams and families. They deserved better than what their civilization did to them. The documents were destroyed on purpose. The grave were unmarked on purpose. They wanted these people forgotten. We refused to forget. Some of them resisted. Bakadwa Wall, age 20, fought so hard during her purification that they had to use chains. Temple correspondence mentions her as a problem case that required extra measures. She survived. We do not know what happened to her after Nefertypes, aged 17, escaped from the temple 3 days before her purification ceremony. She ran away with a young soldier she loved. They were caught. He was executed for stealing temple property because that is what she legally was. She was brought back and went through the rituals anyway. Records note that afterward she was compliant. Isetwa at age 19 refused the herbs, spat them out every time. They had to force them down her throat while holding her nose closed. She choked and vomited repeatedly, but kept refusing. Eventually, they got enough in her system to proceed. Her resistance is preserved in a letter from one priest to another asking for advice on handling difficult subjects. These women did not go quietly. They fought with everything they had. The system was too strong, but they fought anyway. That resistance matters. Oppression, even when resistance seems futile. It shows that the priests knew what they were doing was wrong because they had to force cooperation. It shows that consent was absent, that these were not willing participants in sacred rituals but victims of systematic abuse. That resistance is why we know this story. They made sure we would know, and now we do. So what does all this teach us? What can we learn from this darkness? 3 lessons. First, power without accountability always becomes abuse. Always. The Egyptian priesthood had religious authority, economic power, and legal immunity. That combination made atrocity inevitable. Second, systems designed to control people will always expand their control. The priests started with theological claims about fertility and ended up with complete authority over women's bodies and minds. Third, ordinary people will participate in extraordinary evil when the system encourages it and frames it as righteous. The priests who performed these rituals were not uniquely monstrous. They were us in different circumstances. That is terrifying. But it is also empowering because if we are capable of this, we are also capable of stopping it when we see it happening. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember those 3 things. And here is the uncomfortable truth. We are all capable of this under the right circumstances. We are all susceptible to ideology that reframes abuse as virtue. We are all capable of following authorities who claim divine mandate. We are all capable of ignoring suffering when acknowledging it would cost us something. The priests who hurt Nefertari were not different from us. They were us with different mythology. That should scare us into vigilance. But here is what gives me hope. We are talking about this. You are watching this. These stories are being told. Each generation that learns these lessons is slightly less likely to repeat them. Knowledge is power. Understanding how systematic abuse works is the first step to preventing it. You now understand the warning signs. Religious claims that override bodily autonomy, isolation of victims from families and support networks, drugging or other methods of ensuring compliance, framing resistance as sin or betrayal, layers of institutional protection, economic incentives to continue abuse. When you see these patterns, you can name them. You can resist them. You can refuse to be complicit. That matters. You just watched a deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters. That was not easy. Some of what you heard was hard to process, but you stayed. You wanted to know the truth, and now you do. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you think the truth matters even when it is ugly, then subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that subscribe button and that notification bell. These victims deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told, and most people still do not know this happened. Share this video. Not because I need the views, but because Nefertari and Merit and Henna and all the others deserve to have their suffering acknowledged. Leave a comment telling me 2 things. First, where in the world you are watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And second, what shocked you most about this story? What details stuck with you? Because these are not just history lessons. These are conversations about power and humanity and how we make sure this never happens again. Next time, I am going to tell you about the hidden practices of medieval European nobility that make Egyptian temples look tame by comparison. Another story they tried to bury, another truth they did not want you knowing. You will not want to miss it. See you then. And remember, the truth is always worth knowing, even when it is ugly. The ruins of Egyptian temples still stand today as tourist destinations. Millions walk through Karnak and Luxor and Dendera every year, photographing columns and hieroglyphics. Most have no idea what happened in the chambers beneath their feet. Those underground rooms still exist, sealed now, forgotten. But the stones remember, the walls remember, we remember, and in remembering we resurrect them. In speaking their stories, we give them back their voices. In learning their fates, we honor their sacrifice. They were told they would disappear from history. They were wrong. They are history, and their shadows remind us that the price of silence is always higher than the price of speech, even when speech costs everything.